few seconds here.
And this is for a television audience worldwide.
Yep.
Any system of thought, including contemporary science, has sort of boundaries of what's permissible and what isn't. And there's a kind of taboo about things that go beyond that. Within science, based on a materialist point of view, the mind is the brain. So anything that suggests the mind might be more than the brain goes against the theory, and therefore most scientists don't want to know about it. So there's a very powerful taboo. When people say that the paranormal is paranormal, they don't usually mean that these are things that don't happen. For example, telepathy is extremely common in the modern world. Most people have experienced it. Some people experience it on a daily basis in connection with phone calls. But that doesn't mean it's paranormal, it means it's normal, it happens. It's only paranormal from the point of view of a theory that says it's impossible. If the mind's in the brain, telepathy ought not to happen. So if it does, it's theoretically paranormal. In actual fact, it's normal. Scientific materialism is the belief that the mind is nothing other than the brain. Mental activity is brain activity. All our consciousness is inside our head. And in fact, most people would usually assume consciousness is confined to a small layer at the top of the cerebral cortex. So it's the theory that the mind's in the brain and can't in any way be detached from the brain or stretch out beyond the brain. The paranormal is defined in relation to the normal. It means beyond the normal. Therefore, to define it implies that we know what the normal is. In science, this is often taken to be the materialist theory. Materialists believe that the mind is nothing but the brain. Therefore, anything that suggests the mind can have an influence at a distance, as in telepathy, or become detached from the brain, as in survival of bodily death, is by definition paranormal, beyond the normal. But this is a theoretical definition, and in science we're meant to look at evidence. And if we look at the evidence, we get a very different picture. Things like telepathy are common. The majority of the population say they've experienced it. So it happens. It's evidence. There's a lot of evidence, scientific evidence it happens. So it's normal, not paranormal. It's only paranormal from the point of view of a particular theory. And science isn't committed to particular theories. Science doesn't have to adopt the materialist ideology as its basis. Science is a method of inquiry where we can find out by looking at evidence and constructing hypotheses and understand the world better through proper investigation, not dogma. The only way to find out what's really going on is through investigations. If lots of people have had an experience of a particular kind, then we could say it's normal for people to have this experience. How we explain it is another question. Then we need to investigate that by science. One of the problems with research in this area is that because of the taboo, there's virtually no funding for this area, so there's very little research. Now, the funding is decided by central committees of scientists, and they reflect scientific prejudices and consensus values. It's partly a political question, and I think in a democracy a certain percentage of science funding should be spent on research that actually interests voters. At the moment it's all decided by small committees of science establishment people and representatives of big business. But there's no reason why in a democracy some scientific research shouldn't reflect people's interests. There's no doubt that a great many people are really interested in these questions of survival, of the existence of psychic phenomena, and so on. And if science funding reflected the interests of the population, then a huge amount of money would go into these fields rather than none. Science is not committed to any particular ideology or worldview. It's a method of inquiry. There's a dominant materialism in science that grew up in the 19th century. It's become part of the culture of science, but it's really a dogmatic belief system rather than a testable theory. Things that don't fit in with it, the evidence against materialism, like a lot of the evidence for psychic phenomena, is simply dismissed or treated as taboo. So it's really a matter of maintaining a belief system, and that, in my opinion, is extremely anti-scientific. Science is not about dogma, it's about investigation. Theoretical frameworks are helpful, but we don't have to have a theoretical framework for phenomena we don't understand. We find out about them by investigating them. And people had, they were investigating fossils before Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. They had various theories, but they weren't very solid ones. Some people thought they were left by the flood and so on. we investigate a lot of things in science, like quasars in cosmology, whose nature is unknown. And if you said you can't investigate anything unless you understand it, science would never have got off the ground in the first place. Superstition is really believing something on the basis of a habit, a cultural habit. You're told about it, you go on believing it, even in the absence of any evidence. Well, I would say that in some ways the materialist dogmas of science are a kind of superstition, a belief that anything that doesn't fit into this way of thinking can't possibly exist. It's a kind of anti-superstitious superstition. I think the real question is we need to investigate things on the experimental basis. If a lot of people believe in telepathy, for example, maybe it's a superstition, maybe it really happens. The only way to find out is to study the phenomenon and find out whether it happens or not to adopt the view that it's a superstition, a prejudice against it, and then close off any inquiry. That way we find out nothing. We remain trapped in our belief system. The scientific method is to do with having hypotheses and testing them by means of experiment. It's a method of experimental inquiry. This is, of course, physical in the sense that you're looking at physical evidence, but the kinds of questions you ask depend on ideas that go beyond science and which are called metaphysical. And materialism, for example, is a metaphysical doctrine. It says that the only physical reality is matter. Now, it doesn't prove that. It says it. It starts from that as an assumption. And with that assumption, you investigate what matter does. Anything that doesn't appear to be explicable in terms of matter is regarded as non-existent, as a metaphysical assumption. Every kind of science starts from some kind of metaphysics, a belief in the larger framework within which science takes place. And in scientific revolutions, there's a challenge to the existing metaphysical doctrines, and they're replaced by something else. Another doctrine in modern science is that nature is governed by laws that are fixed for all time and were all there at the moment of the Big Bang. We can't possibly prove that. We can't go back in time to the Big Bang to see if all the laws of nature were there. My own view is that they might have evolved, that even the laws of nature evolve, or that they're more like habits. So science is always based on metaphysical assumptions. This is necessary, but the methods of investigation through experiments look at physical evidence. If one says that the conscious experiences that people have during a near-death experience are produced by the brain, they would rather depend on brain activity. But there's new evidence from Pim van Lommel in the Netherlands. It shows that in fact in people having near-death experiences the brain was completely flat-lined. There was no measurable electrical activity of it at all. He actually had electroencephalographs on people's brains when they underwent near-death experiences, and he was able to show that the brain activity, the chaotic brain activity or the hyperactivity that some people postulated just wasn't going on. The brain was to all intents not active at all. So here we have conscious experiences associated with a brain that doesn't seem very active. He thinks that this evidence, the best evidence we have so far, suggests that consciousness can operate independently of the brain. Acquiring information when in an out-of-the-body state, as in an out-of-the-body experience or near-death experience, only tells us that people can acquire information somehow. It doesn't necessarily prove that their centre of consciousness has moved outside the body, or that they're acquiring it by some strange means from a centre outside the body. It's conceivable it's being acquired by the body and then entering their consciousness, wherever that centre of consciousness appears to be. The evidence seems to me ambiguous, and I don't think you can draw any firm conclusion one way or the other. Even if somebody knows what's going on somewhere else, if you take seriously the idea of telepathy, you see it's possible they picked it up telepathically from someone who knew what was going on there. As soon as you allow for things like telepathy, which personally I think are well supported by evidence, then you don't have to assume that they go out of the body and see something with disembodied eyes. They could have picked it up telepathically from someone else who was seeing it. That may seem improbable. In fact, both explanations seem improbable, really. But, you know, we're going to have to choose between improbable explanations to explain this kind of evidence. We don't know how telepathy is working, you see. If we don't know that telepathy is necessarily working through the brain. So if the fact the brain's flatlined doesn't prove that telepathy is impossible in that state, my own view is that telepathy is a field phenomenon, that our minds are fields of activity, and that telepathy depends on field connections. Now, those fields may or may not be detachable from the brain. That's very much an open question. But one can't say that the telepathic acquisition of information has to depend on a functioning brain. I mean, we just don't know. We're in the realm of the unknown here. I think that telepathy tells us that our consciousness is not simply confined to our brains, that there are links between people at a distance which enable information to be transferred. I've done a lot of work on telepathy. I think the evidence is extremely strong. It shows the mind is more than the brain, and it implies that the mind is like a system of fields that project out beyond the brain, just as a cell phone has invisible fields that go beyond the surface of the cell phone, or a magnet has fields that go beyond the surface of a magnet. So I think our minds extend beyond the brain. Telepathy is consistent with a field theory of the mind, but in these examples, telepathy is still rooted in the brain. Now, near-death experiences and out-of-the-body experiences rather suggest that the centre of consciousness can be detached from the brain. If telepathy is a system of fields, then the question is, can these fields leave the brain and be sort of free-floating in space? Now, that's quite a big jump, and I find it rather hard to know what to think about that. I'm perfectly happy with the idea of fields extending around the brain to explain telepathy, which is a much less challenging phenomenon than these out-of-the-body experiences or evidence for communication from the dead. Telepathy is, pretty close to ordinary kind of scientific reality, in my opinion, and relatively simple to understand. These things go much further and are much more challenging, and I honestly don't know the answer. I'm never quite sure what people mean when they say consciousness is non-local. I think consciousness is located normally in our bodies. I mean, we have a point of view which is normally located inside our bodies. My point of view now is based on where I'm sitting. It's not distributed at random anywhere in the universe. It's centered here. I can have non-local interactions. If I have a telepathic communication with somebody in Australia, then there's an influence that doesn't seem to be dependent on distance or locality that passes between us. But that person is also localized in a particular place in Australia. So you can have non-local interactions. And in physics, when people talk about non-local interactions, they mean that one thing and another thing can be linked at a distance in a way that doesn't seem to depend on how far apart they are. But these things nevertheless have locations. To say non-local in a general sense implies that it has no place, no locality. All our conscious experience has locality. Even out-of-the-body experiences have a location for the consciousness near the ceiling of the room, for example. It's still located at a particular point in this physical universe. So it's a little confusing to use the word non-locality as if it implies that nothing has a place. I think that our normal consciousness works through fields, that in perception, our perceptual world is projected out. I think vision involves light coming into the eyes and the visual world being projected out. So if you see me sitting here now, your image of me isn't inside your brain, where the materialists say it is. It's where it seems to be. It's projected out by you to where I'm sitting. So consciousness involves a system of fields, of perceptual fields, that are going on the whole time, even in ordinary experience. Our mind isn't confined to the inside of the brain, any more than the field of a magnet's confined to the inside of the iron bar. Nevertheless, normally the consciousness is rooted in the brain. There are two circumstances when we experience our consciousness as not being rooted in our brain, as being located in some other body or place. And the first, and in my opinion the most important and interesting, is in dreams. Everybody's had the experience of having a centre of consciousness outside their physical body during dreams. I may dream that I'm running along the road, even flying, and yet my physical body's asleep in bed. So every one of us has a dream body, an alternative body, and another kind of body that we experience subjectively from within on a nightly basis. which has a world going on around it, and in our dreams we're centered in this body. We may not always be conscious or aware of it, but we always have a point of view centered in this body. So everybody knows from the experience of dreams that we can experience our consciousness as being located somewhere other than in our physical body. Sometimes in dreams we dream about familiar places. Sometimes we're dreaming about fantastical places that don't really exist. But it shows that our body can occupy a space in a kind of conscious realm of possibility or imagination or conscious construction that's not inside our body. I think the best way of understanding the out-of-the-body and near-death experiences is to see this as being close to the dream phenomenon, where our dream body, or something like our dream body, becomes detached from our ordinary body, just as it does in dreams. It's just that they're more clear, or we're more aware of what's going on. And this does in fact occur in a particular class of dreams called lucid dreams, dreams where people know they're dreaming, and they're aware that they're in their dream body, and they can go where they like, and they have gain a kind of power over the dream state. This is something practiced by shamans in traditional cultures. It's something that many people have had spontaneously in our own. So to me, the key to the question is understanding the dream body, because that's the normal experience that all of us have had, even if we've never had an out-of-the-body experience. In our dreams, we've all experienced being outside our normal body, in some other body, or in some other center of consciousness. Well, the dream body is sometimes called the astral body, and so some people call the conscious control of out-of-the-body experiences astral projection. I don't think the word astral helps us very much. I prefer the word dream body, because dream body is so clear, it's plain English, and everybody knows that they've got a dream body because they've all experienced it. If you talk about astral bodies, then it brings in a whole esoteric nomenclature that's rather puzzling. The word astral suggests a connection with the stars, and it's not at all obvious why you should call this dream body after the stars. We may think of our dreams as fantastical and unreal, and in many ways they are. But when we're having a dream, when we're dreaming, it seems real enough to us, and a nightmare can be genuinely frightening. It's not just imaginarily frightening, it's really frightening. And a wet dream in a man is, really wet. I mean, this is things are actually happening in the dreams. It's not just a fantastical realm. So to dismiss our dream experience on the grounds it's not real is something we only do on the basis of a comparison with waking life. Now, say you float out of your body and you have a near-death experience, and this is like being in a dream. And say it's not a near-death experience, say it's a real death experience. What happens if you go on floating and you're, as it were, trapped in a kind of dream body state, a dream body world? The difference from an ordinary dream is you can't wake up any longer because you haven't got a living body to wake up into. And what if survival of bodily death is rather like being in a dream from which you can't wake up? That seems to me the most plausible way of thinking about it, in fact, because we already know from our own experience we can be in a realm of conscious experience with a kind of body in our dreams that's not the same as the ordinary realm. We already know that our dreams are tremendously influenced by our preoccupations, our fears, our desires. We can have nightmares, which are usually about being trapped or unable to escape, or being chased or being threatened by some destructive force, like a monster. All these things may happen after we're dead, and people may have a great range of different experiences after they're dead, depending on the kind of person they are. It might be like being in a dream from which you can't wake up. I think it's much easier to approach the subject of survival of bodily death by starting from our experience, and particularly our experience of dreams, than it is to start from brain physiology. After all, we know very little about the connection between brain physiology and consciousness. The assumption in conventional science it's all inside the brain, I think, is false anyway, because I think our minds are fields that stretch out beyond the brain. So starting from dreams, I think, is the best way of beginning to understand what might be going on in these various experiences. In trying to understand after-death communications and other kinds of influence from people who are apparently dead, assuming it's not just a matter of telepathy. For me, the interesting question is looking at dreaming people. Can someone who's dreaming have an influence at a distance by visiting that place in their dream body? In a lucid dream, people can actually will where they go. They go and visit friends, they say they've seen things happening. And sometimes, in those cases, there are reports that people have seen them or felt a presence, or an animal in the room has reacted as if somebody was there. In other words, the projection of their dream body to a particular place, in what's sometimes called astral projection, does seem to have effects in that place in some cases. Now, perhaps such a person could even influence or even possess somebody in that place to start saying things or communicate through somebody or bring about even physical influences. I don't know. I think that that's the place to look research-wise, the evidence for people in lucid dreams being able to influence things at a distance. If they can, then we'd have, from the study of lucid dreams, the idea that a dream body can bring about effects under certain circumstances, can even be seen or have the presence felt by others. This would then be relevant to the whole question of a dream body theory of survival, because after somebody's dead, perhaps the same kind of thing could happen. They could appear in particular places, bring about effects, people could feel their presence. It might be that the ability some people seem to have to influence others or to have effects in particular places when they're in their dream state, in the dream body, is comparable to what happens after people are dead, the evidence for survival from communication through mediums and so forth. I think in this whole field of research, people have ignored too much the evidence from dream research, because I think it's highly relevant, and I think it's the main clue we have about the nature of what's going on in these survival states. Science has done very little to investigate the afterlife or reincarnation. Most materialists assume that both of them are impossible. So there's a kind of dogmatic denial by some scientists of the possibility of these things. But I wouldn't say that was a scientific understanding. I would say that was a dogmatic, ideologically motivated dismissal. The only way to have a scientific understanding is to do the research and to find out what's actually happening and to look at the evidence. In relation to reincarnation, the best evidence is from Ian Stevenson's studies on children who remember previous lives. I think he's established beyond doubt that some children have memories that correspond to things that happened in previous lives that they couldn't have known otherwise. Now, that doesn't necessarily prove reincarnation. What it shows is there's been a transfer of memory. My own view is that we all tap into a kind of collective memory, and perhaps in these cases there's a specific transfer of memories from particular people. Maybe it's reincarnation, maybe it's memory transfer. And even if these children have been reincarnated, does that prove that everyone else has been and we've just forgotten all the details? Or does it mean that reincarnation, even if it is reincarnation, is a rare exception? Personally, I think it's an exception rather than the rule. And in Stevenson's cases, the previous personalities, the memories that were remembered, are highly non-random. They show the majority of the people were murdered and the others died violent or sudden deaths. So it's a particular category of people who seem to have past life memories, or at least a particular category of past life. So it may be exceptional rather than the rule. To distinguish between a transference of memory and real reincarnation in cases where people have memories from previous lives would be difficult. One way would be to see whether you can have two people with the same memories at the same time. And I think there are such cases. That would then argue against a reincarnation theory that said you have a kind of unit soul that goes from body to body. But I suppose reincarnationists could say, oh well, sometimes it splits up like twins and you've got, and you can go into two bodies at the same time. So it's hard to find a conclusive experiment to distinguish between reincarnation and memory transfer. But it also leads us into philosophical questions. What is it that your personality is? You know, in Buddhist philosophy, there is no such thing as the core personality. There's just a bundle of memories. and you may have some memories from some person in another life, but that doesn't prove that the very essence of you has moved over from that other life. And indeed some schools of Hinduism, where reincarnation is widely accepted, say that what's moving from life to life is only a few memories or dispositions, but the essence of the self is not personal at all. It's Atman and Brahman. This is the ultimate principle. It's present in all people, and you can't really say that it moves from one to the other. One analogy they give is that if you have buckets of water and you see the moon reflected in the buckets of water, if you see it first in one bucket and then in another, it's not that the moon's jumped from one bucket to another. It's both of them are reflecting something that's beyond themselves. So even in Eastern philosophy, there's no clear, easy to grasp concept of reincarnation that would enable us to decide between memory transfer and reincarnation. So this leads us into very deep areas of philosophy as well as science. Some of Stevenson's most impressive evidence comes from these birthmark cases where people have birthmarks corresponding to wounds that apparently were usually to do with the murder of the previous personality. Here I think it shows that there are inherited influences that affect not just the memories but also the body itself. I myself think that the inheritance of body form takes place through a process I call morphic resonance. I think that, as well as memory, depends on a kind of collective memory principle. So even if there's a transfer of some features of a previous body, like birthmarks, where bullet wounds were, you could have a kind of body memory transfer. But again, that wouldn't necessarily prove an individual reincarnation theory. It would show that there was a strong influence from a particular previous person that's influenced both the body and the mind of a later person. A transfer of memories, but it wouldn't necessarily prove that they were that person. This really then becomes a matter of what you would believe on philosophical or theological grounds about what reincarnation is and what the essence of the person is. I don't know how the reincarnation birthmark cases work, how to explain those. A reincarnation would be one possibility, but there would also be a possibility of transfer of memory through the fields that shape the growing body, what I call morphic fields, which depend on a kind of memory and influence from the past. And if there's an influence from a particular person in the past with bullet wounds or something that influences this body as it grows in the embryo, there's certainly something working through the field influencing the form from a particular person in the past as part of a collective influence from lots of other people in the past. It's a kind of memory effect, but it doesn't necessarily prove complete reincarnation. After all, the newly born child or the young child who has the memories doesn't look exactly like the other person. It's not as if their entire bodily form has been transferred from one body to another. It hasn't. They look different. It's just they resemble them in certain features. And when they have conscious memories of previous lives, it's not as if the whole of their memory is filled with these memories. They say these things sometimes, but they have other things in their minds as well, and quite often they forget these memories of past lives by the time they're 7 or 8 years old. So it's not as if there's a total package deal where an entire bodily form, an entire set of memories, habits and dispositions is shifted from one body to another. There's a transfer, even on the best available evidence, Stevenson's evidence, of certain influences among others, and those others have come from other people in the past. I think we're all a kind of composite. People who have memories of previous lives may have specifically enhanced memories of certain people in the past, but this is not the whole of their personality, nor is it the whole of their bodily form. It accounts for certain marks, like birthmarks, but not the shape of their nose, the size of their face, even their sex, because some people are born as boys when the previous personality was a girl. These are pretty major differences. The Scole experiments were done carefully, and they were done as properly as was possible under the circumstances. And all of us would have liked to have infrared sensitive cameras filming what was going on and more light in the room. But this is something that, for various reasons, they wouldn't or couldn't agree to. Now, the cynics would say this is because they'd got something to hide. they would say this is because these phenomena can only manifest in darkness, and it wouldn't be possible to look at them under these conditions, and for some reason they didn't want it to be filmed with infrared cameras. So this is something which the scientists and the psychical investigators involved were very keen to try and have done, but it was just not something that the mediums or the spirits that spoke through them would agree to. So unfortunately the evidence isn't as conclusive as it would have been if phenomena had been captured on film and there'd been sufficient light in the room to rule out certain other explanations. When I attended a sitting in Scole with the Scole Group, this was in a basement. It was dark. The mediums wore luminous bands around their wrists so that you could see where their arms were. But apart from that, there were no lights in the room, and so it was extremely dark. In the course of the session, there were things where lights appeared. At one stage there were small lights darting around the room, and my mind was trying all the time to think of so-called rational explanations for this. I thought at first that the lights must be small light-emitting diodes suspended on the end of nylon fishing line type things. And I more or less come to the conclusion that's what was happening, that they must have found some way of waving fishing rods around with these lights on the end. When the light came down in front of it, went pop, went through the table and came out the other side, and then floated up the other side. Now, no nylon fishing line explanation would account for it going through an apparently solid, well, it was a solid object, a table. So there were things there that I just couldn't understand in terms of any normal kind of explanation. This is where people who are experienced conjurers and illusionists come in, and they always say, oh, well, there's a way of doing it, we can trick people, and so on. The trouble is you get into this shadowy realm where you get claims from illusionists who claim to have a superior knowledge of all these tricks. I don't know of any that have duplicated that trick or shown how it could be done. I mean, it doesn't seem like a trick, but I mean, I couldn't stop all these skeptical thoughts flooding through my mind as I sat there seeing these things happen. At one stage, a disembodied hand appeared, and appeared to be floating over the table. I asked Mrs. Bradshaw, who was speaking through one of the mediums, if this was a disembodied hand. I said, I can see a disembodied hand. She said, it's not a disembodied hand. I said, you mean it's got an invisible body attached? And she said, precisely. And then she said, would you like it to touch you? And I said, yes. So she said, well, ask it. So I said, hand, will you touch me? And so the hand went round behind me and it tapped me on the shoulder. And then I saw it moving down and again floating over the table. Well, this again was extremely difficult to make any sense of. My mind went into overdrive thinking of explanations, you know, hands that were somehow with strings holding them up, and I mean, trying to think how this could be done through some kind of cheap conjuring trick. I couldn't think of any explanation of that kind. And then, when I was there, a crystal on the table started glowing and moving around. So there were some lights from these apparently self-luminous objects. And so there were a number of strange physical movements and phenomena which were exceedingly hard to understand, which didn't make sense in any normal terms, which, if they were conjuring tricks, would have required extraordinary ingenuity. And I couldn't see any evidence that the people were moving around or doing this kind of thing, nor, since they seemed decent, honest, quite ordinary people, could I see why they'd want to get up to such elaborate tricks as these. So I was completely baffled by the entire experience. And I really couldn't see, even if you accept the afterlife explanation, that these really were disembodied spirits speaking through the mediums. I still couldn't understand why, even if they were disembodied spirits, they want to make little light-emitting diode-type lamps whiz around the room, or have disembodied hands appear, or make crystals float in the air and glow with a mysterious light. And the whole thing was utterly baffling, even if one took it at face value. These occurrences were evidences of something very strange happening. You could perhaps call it psychokinesis, which is mind over matter effects. But say there were real mind over matter effects going on as opposed to conjuring tricks, then how do we know they were coming from the minds of the disembodied people rather than from the minds of the mediums who were sitting in the room? In poltergeist phenomena, disturbed adolescents typically can be associated with the movements of solid objects. I've investigated a poltergeist case in North London. It involved bottles of Bailey's Irish cream being flung across rooms, writing appearing on walls, items of furniture toppling over, and so forth. These are quite big physical effects, bigger than any I saw at Scole. Yet we don't invoke disembodied people who are dead to explain these. These seem to be associated with mental disturbances in the mind of a teenager, in this case, a teenage girl. So if minds can produce these kinds of effects and do so in poltergeist-type phenomena, then minds might have been producing them at Scole, but then the question is whose mind? Were they coming perhaps through the unconscious minds of the mediums who may not consciously have been causing these effects any more than disturbed adolescents consciously cause poltergeist phenomena? Or were they caused by seemingly discarnate spirits like Mrs. Bradshaw, who seemed a very respectable middle-class lady from Cambridge in the early part of the 20th century. But even if it was Mrs. Bradshaw, why would she have wanted to make small lights whiz around the room?